Hello and welcome to the Ecomodernist channel live. I'm Carl Pauls. We're joined today by Gabriel Ignetti, Chris Bergen, and our guest. Michael C. Lynch is a distinguished fellow at the Energy Policy Research Foundation and president of Strategic Energy and Economic Research. He has been a researcher at the MIT Energy Laboratory and Center for International Studies. He is a past president of the U.S. Association for Energy Economics. He's here to discuss his book, The Peak Oil Scare and the Coming Oil Flood, and Other Energy Matters. Welcome, Mike. How's it going today?
Thank you. It's going pretty well.
Yeah. So with that, why don't you take us straight into the thesis, your introduction, and the subject matter of your book?
Okay. Well, so people say, oh, oil production follows a bell curve, which they then named a Hubbard curve after the geologist. And they said, therefore, because this is a geological law, you can predict the production of oil. And once you peak and decline, you've produced half the oil in a field or the country or the world. And the problem is a lot of countries peak and decline and then go up and down and go up and down. So it doesn't work to tell you when you're at half. But also, if you spend maybe 3 minutes, you can download a data set of world oil production for 50 years and see that most countries don't follow a bell curve. And these guys just sort of assume it worked once, it must be good. The other aspect was you had all these people who didn't know anything about oil, but they go, oh my God, it's so hard to produce oil. I just can't believe we can keep raising production. My favorite was one of the guys who trashed me on the internet, who I'm sorry to say he has a PhD in physics from MIT, my alma mater. He said, well, JP Morgan says that in order to offset depletion of oil fields, we need to find a new Saudi Arabia every 2 years. That's simply impossible. What he didn't know was that 30 years earlier, Jimmy Carter said, in order to replace depletion, we need a new Saudi Arabia every 3 years. And none of these people ever thought, well, have we not been replacing depletion? And the answer is, yeah, depletion's been here since the first well was drilled. And the industry has to offset it to increase it. The other thing I love was people keep looking at me seriously, even geologists say, well, oil is finite. And I go, wasn't it finite 50 years ago? I go, well, yeah. And isn't it true that it's not finite? It's actually renewable. It's biological material formed by geochemical products. They go, well, yeah, but, very slowly. Go, well, so you're saying it's not whether it's finite or not. It's the numbers that matter. I mean, if you wanted renewable, we could use whale oil because that's renewable, right? So this goes back to, the neo-Malthusianism. And people think Malthus started it. And people forget Malthus published his first thing saying, oh, my God, we're all going to be starving to death soon. But he kept collecting data, and he finally said, oh, I was wrong. Actually, agricultural productivity is overtaking population growth, so it's not really a problem. Most people don't read his stuff. They just know kind of the classic comics version, as we said when I was a boy. Now I guess it'd be the TikTok version of Malthus. But you can go back 2,000 years to the ancient Romans, and even the Greeks. Some of them thought that, the Earth's carrying capacity had been surpassed, and the gods started the Trojan War to try to reduce the population. But the thing is, you get into things like TED Talks or Davos Talks, and if you look at my book, there's just page after page of tables and graphs. And you go to a TED Talk, and there's a lot of hand-waving and cliches and sloganeering. And some of them are very good, and some of them are just very shallow and often even wrong. So the Rocky Mountain Institute has 18 years ago published Winning the Oil Endgame. And they said, oh, we can easily replace 75% of our oil consumption between cellulosic ethanol and hypercars, I think is what Amy Levin's called it, which, if you spend an extra $60,000 to $80,000, you can double or maybe triple the mileage in your car. And I guess he is an engineer, so I guess the economics don't really matter to him much.
We predict things like, more efficient light bulbs, and then we have Javan's paradox, where the public says, oh boy, it's so efficient, I must consume more energy now in order to improve our lifestyle. And this is sort of part of the thesis of ecomodernism, is that humans love to have a high quality of life. So we need to shape our adoption of technology to be the most efficient as possible because, of course, humans are going to want more. And more is in and of itself not necessarily a vice. It is possible to have more of everything and have that be a vice, but we can intelligently craft our cities, our transportation systems, our energy systems so that we're not trapped in this cycle.
First, just want to say thanks to Michael Lynch for joining us today and sharing his expertise. Also, you mentioned about renewable at different rates and such, and I've noticed myself that nuclear energy, uranium, and thorium are renewable at the correct time scale, being more like galactic time scales. So, do you know how quickly oil is renewable at? Are we using it like 5 times faster or 20 times faster than it would normally be renewed by natural processes?
Oh, it's the production is about 3 million barrels a year, and we use about, I think, 30 billion barrels a year. So yeah, the renewable rate is not significant. It only matters in the sense that when you talk about finite versus infinite, which is just kind of a non-issue.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the neo-Malthusian problem has always been that they go, the earth is finite and therefore everything's finite and therefore we have to run out at some point. And this goes back to the limits to growth arguments. But Carl, obviously, you're a follower of the American philosopher George Carlin, who did a whole routine on stuff. People like stuff. We need more bigger cars for us. I don't like SUVs. I think they're too big and unwieldy, but I don't care if people with one kid want to drive an SUV. That's their choice. And like you say, I don't see a lot of people adopting the Amish lifestyle and saying, consumerism is horrible. I'd rather live a simple life, which, you can easily do. Well, I don't know how easy it is. I'm descended from a long line of farmers, like I guess pretty much everybody on the planet, if you go back far enough. But it's, yeah. Shoveling out the pig pen is not my idea of a fun date, shall we say. But, this goes back to probably, I don't know, Zoroastrianism. I'm sure I got that wrong. The idea that there's the material world and the spiritual world, and the spiritual world is good, and it's where the angels live. But we all live in the material world. And that's bad. And you should try to reduce your connection to the material world. Famously, Simeon the Stylite was a Christian hermit about, I think, 700 AD, who stood on a pillar just so he could get further from the earth. And at some point, he actually stood on one leg to reduce his contact. Funny thing is, people would then flock to him and bring him food and stuff because they thought he must have some sort of a special wisdom. He was kind of a Kim Kardashian of the day, I guess, pre-internet. There's too many people who confuse their personal preferences for what is good or bad more generally. And, like I say, I don't like SUVs. I don't like cornbread that much, but I don't write books saying that, cornbread is evil and should be banned the way some people do about cars or about fossil fuels or nuclear power. Or I know a guy who hates wind power, and, nothing you say, you can't convince him that maybe wind sometimes is better.
So let me follow up one important thing, because we want to make sure that we're framing this right. You say we will see the sum total state of the Earth, and not talking what's discoverable or what is accessible, of complex hydrocarbons that we can turn into fuel in the Earth's crust goes up by 3 million barrels a year. Is that right?
Yes. Well, that's the petroleum, and I haven't seen numbers for coal or gas, but it's probably in that range.
What's the mechanism for that?
Basically, you have organic material, and a lot of this it's not from the Jurassic. I forget, the Paleozoic maybe. Oil is mostly from microorganisms that became compressed and heated over time, and they gradually evolved into petroleum and natural gas. Coal, I think, is more from plant matter. That's why if you look at in a coal field, you'll see little ferns in the coal.
So those microorganisms do exist in the crust still. Are they continuing alive at this time, or are they all sort of dead and decaying at this time?
This is all they're buried deep underground. A lot of what we have now in, the Texas, the Gulf Coast, that comes from when there was an inland sea, and it's sort of the Mississippi was, I don't know, 500 or 600 miles wide. And again, that was not in recent times. So you got layers and layers of organic material laid down. And then as you got hard rock on top, it got compressed and turned into hydrocarbons.
Okay, so let's go even further into the prediction. Isn't that organic material finite?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, the whales are renewable, but we used them up pretty good in the 18th, 19th century. So the thing is, you're talking a century or two of hydrocarbons, depending on what you assume about population growth and economic growth. But there's enough to basically turn the Earth into an easy bake oven if you wanted to.
Yeah, we could go up like 7 degrees Celsius if you look at the history of our geologic timescale.
But, we've adapted a long time. A lot of what's now the North Sea was above water if you go back 8,000 or 10,000 years. And supposedly, one reason the Angles and Saxons moved from Germany to England around 600, 700 AD was because some of the land they lived on was going underwater. So, we can do a lot of things. We can adapt a lot. Somebody just posted, I think it was claimed to be a fake tweet from 5 years ago that we have 5 years to stop using fossil fuels or we go extinct. And, you have people on both extremes. The James Imhoff, who holds up a snowball in the Hall of Congress, said, look, see, there's no global warming. It's a Chinese hoax. And then you have the Extinction Rebellion people who say, we're all going to die within 8 or 10 years. Burn your SUVs or burn somebody else's SUVs, I guess. And there's not a lot of people saying, what is the best thing to do? And I point out that, well, I'm not a big fan of electric vehicles. And in fact, I'll just mention, I did a paper and I was comparing the Tesla and modern gasoline power cars. And the Tesla's a lot more expensive and it's a lot snazzier. And it has something like it's 50% less maintenance costs, I think. On the other hand, as you alluded to, Tesla used to have on their website a calculator which showed you how much range you would lose at different temperatures and speeds. They seem to have taken that down. But the point is that electric cars are a particularly expensive way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially when you think the Earth still gets, I think, 25-30% of our energy comes from coal, which is the dirtiest, the most carbon intensive. And people are still building coal power plants in China and India. Germany just, opened up a new lignite mine. And, to me, I admit I'm sort of a bit of a geek. I love the small modular reactors. I think that's really, a perfect answer to a lot of problems. And I think if we deployed those, shut down all the coal plants, let people keep using gas in their homes for now, and slowly, my grandchildren, assuming I ever have any, may be in an all-electric world, but I don't think we're close to that yet.
Are we at peak demand? And I'll sort of frame this by saying, look at the global north and our CO2 output and our embrace of electric vehicles. We decrease our CO2 emissions by about 2 to 3% per year, yet our economy keeps growing. However, the rest of the world, that is seeing exactly the reverse. And so we have basically, we're treading water when it comes to CO2 output. Is it the same for fossil fuels? And is it are we at peak demand where eventually this renewable energy, nuclear energy, and batteries are going to take over the world? Is it victory for clean energy technology yet?
Peak demand is different from peak supply because it's a real thing in the sense that I don't think we're going to stop using fossil fuels because we don't have them, but people may choose to. We still have horses, but I haven't ridden one since I can remember. And people sort of said, wow, you mean if I buy this newfangled automobile, I don't have to shovel horse manure? 22 pounds on average for the typical horse. But the thing is, when you say, okay, is it good enough? And this is the problem, is that you have advocates been saying for 30 or 40 years, yes, it's good enough. Ralph Nader once argued we shouldn't use nuclear power. This is in the 70s. He said, renewables are already cheaper than nuclear, which was just, if they're 90% cheaper now and they're roughly competitive, how could they have been cheaper 40, 50 years ago? And you certainly have a lot of applications. I mean, it's a niche market, getting bigger all the time. I think electric vehicles, they're better as a second car than a primary car because of the range problem. And you can easily imagine in urban centers, they could come to dominate. I like the concept of, autonomous vehicles where you press an app on your phone and a car unplugs from a nearby charging station, come get you and takes you someplace, kind of like Total Recall, Johnny Cab without the Schwarzenegger. But I don't think we're there yet. I brought a book down called The Next Big Thing, and it's about the Stirling engine, which, the author thought this was going to take over automobiles. It's an external combustion engine. You may remember Shai Agassi, who said he had Better Place, and he was a big superstar at Davos and TED Talks and stuff. And he said, look, we're going to build service stations with robots that will swap out the battery in your cars. And it turned out it worked great for taxi cabs, where they all go back to a central station every night. Didn't work out anywhere else, and it was just too expensive. So
it works in Southeast Asia with these electric scooters, and people will yank out these 4 kilowatt hour battery that I'm drooling over, wishing I could put that in my bicycle so that I could ride it on the bike infrastructure here. Is just too big. So, and it's not really.
Those are lead acid batteries, I think, right?
I know they're increasingly becoming lipo or lithium batteries of some kind. Okay. It's really exciting, but it's not the kind of technology that has taken hold in America, unfortunately. We don't have the culture where we trust someone with a deteriorating resource. That's a battery that loses value over time. We want to hold on to the value of the battery that we purchased, and we don't want to give it away to someone else. Chris, why don't you go ahead?
Can I just add something else about peak demand?
Sure.
The Stone Age ended 4,000 years ago, but the amount of gravel sold every year is at record highs. The Bronze Age ended 2,500 years ago, and copper sales are at record highs. So we replaced the steam engine in locomotives with diesel engines. We replaced horses with cars. But raw materials, much less the case. I mean, you can still make a lot of money selling wood.
Yeah.
I just had a quick comment. You mentioned back in the 70s, they said how cheap renewables could be. But you need to be very cautious about chasing cheap. And
price matters. It's a big thing. It's not the only thing.
Yeah. My other question, I guess a little bit similar. If oil prices are $50 or $80, there's so much which makes sense to get out of our reserves. But if it should spike, say, close to $200, that opens up other reserves. Do you have any idea how much more reserves are out there, depending on how high the price would skyrocket to?
Yeah, the biggest problem is in the short term, the price shoots up. People start drilling like crazy. The cost of drilling shoots up. This is what happened in the 70s and 10 years ago. There's a big resource base. Unfortunately, most of the estimates sort of go, here's what's technically recoverable, and then the rest is not. And technically recoverable is thought to be something like 40% of conventional oil and less than 10% of oil sands and shale oil. If the price went to 150, 200, you could get a lot more out of that. Most people don't try to run the numbers on that, but they show Jed Clampett shooting at some food and say, see, that was the easy oil. And I go, my granddad drilled some wells in the 1890s in West Virginia, and I suspect he used a mule to move the rig. And if you ever worked with a mule, it wasn't easy. What you get in theory, and this is something my mentor Maury Edelman wrote in 1986, he said, as you use up oil, you theoretically use the best stuff first. And so you're gradually using worse and worse stuff. And that's one of the basic tenets of mineral economics. But he said, you also get better technology, better science, which offsets to some degree. How much is an empirical question. And what you find is when you look at mineral prices over the last 150 years or more, they don't tend to go up faster than inflation because people seem to, get better at about the same rate as they deplete the resource. So what would happen is, if you said, oh, if the price is 210 years from now, how much more oil we could get, and say, well, if it goes up $5 a year, then probably you're going to see an increase in the oil recoverable resource go up by, 5% a year, something like that. My favorite story, which unfortunately I was not present for, I was too junior, but in the early 80s, the CEO of Exxon came to MIT and he said, well, everybody knows the price of oil is 30 now, and in 10 years it'll be $100, which would be about 250 now. And he said, so we're going to build these big oil shale, not shale oil, but oil shale strip mines in Colorado, 5 miles wide, long by 1 mile wide, and dig up this oil and crack it up and produce oil, because everybody knows the price of oil never goes down. And Maury Edelman, who told me this story, yeah, Maury Edelman, and I'll give you a good quote in a second. But Maury Edelman said this: the chief economist was sitting there, and he was a former student of his, and he went to him and said, "Do you believe that?" And he said, "You've heard the official company policy." There's a book by a guy who's still one of the most famous petroleum experts, and I won't mention his name because he was wildly wrong, but so was everybody else at the time. In 1983, the book was called Energy Future, and he said, there are some people who are misleading the public into thinking oil prices won't keep going up forever. And this is not a good thing. And of course, that was 2 years before the price collapsed. And, Maury Edelman was one of those who said the price can go up, but it doesn't have to go up. And people for years said, what an idiot this guy is. And when the price collapsed in 1985, people came pounding on his door, tell us what's going on. So, Will Rogers once said, buy land, they ain't making any more of it. Well, you can lose a lot of money on real estate because it's cyclical. And the same is true of oil and gas. We're not running out, but boy, it can go really high if something happens in the Middle East, and it can go really low if there's a recession.
Let's step back to comparative economics and talk about something that a lot of us energy nerds really know about, and that's sort of what is often quoted as the levelized cost of energy, or in other words, the sometimes energy plus storage or energy plus system plus storage, the total costs, or even just the incremental costs. Do renewables compete? Are renewables going to push oil out of the market so that we really are at peak demand, where renewables are just going to save us from running out of oil?
Well, renewables mainly compete in the power sector. Biofuels, frankly, to replace just the aviation fuel and the heavy trucking fuel with biofuels, you would need to triple the land globally that's used for biofuels instead of food production, which I don't think is a good idea. And, I'm burning down the Amazon to make soybeans or sugar for ethanol. I don't think is a good idea. Now, what you find is it's a cliche that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. And people just repeat that because they've seen it a bunch of times. And it's always repeated by people who want to believe that. Looking at the numbers, what you find is that, in some places, wind and solar are pretty cheap. You talk about the desert in the Middle East, and they're using cheap labor, and frankly, the government maybe gives them the land, but that doesn't include storage. So you have the problem of you have to calculate the cost of storage, which is very high, and depends partly on whether you want to, assume you might have no sun for 3 days instead of 7 days, that sort of thing. And what's your backup? And a lot of times people seem to say, well, assume that the natural gas price will be $10 because it was that much for, a year, as opposed to $3 for 5 years. And so you can play with the numbers a lot. And what you find is solar and wind are competitive where there's a high concentration and you have cheap labor and land. But, when you talk about places like Northern Europe, where, the old joke was, oh, Goring says that the British will never bomb Berlin. He was talking about how bad the weather was, not how good the Luftwaffe was. I haven't seen any place where the price of electricity has gone down because of renewable energy. it seems instead to be going up. And when you try to sign a contract, from what I can tell, they always say, oh, the price you're going to pay for the renewable goes up 3% a year. And it's like, well, wait a minute, your costs don't go up 3% a year because it's all sunk costs pretty much. So why should it go up 3% a year? And it kind of reminds me of the old days of Enron, where they would say, oh, we'll give you a 20-year fixed price natural gas contract. The gas price is $2. We'll sell it to you for $2.50 plus 3% a year for 20 years. And you want that because you want stable prices. You don't want cheap prices. And the answer was nobody bought those contracts. That was not the worst thing they did, but it was up there.
So let me get this straight. So we're not going to see a failure of renewables because of NIMBYs or anything like that. It could simply be that the land in Mendocino County and other places in California is too expensive and the farmers aren't going to pay the leases to put up solar or wind. Why break up a good business to accept renewables?
NIMBY is a problem. It can be resolved. It will slow down the deployment of wind and solar, especially in the northern hemisphere where land tends to be a lot more expensive. I think that's a big part of the problem. And you know, as you run into more and more problems with intermittency, I think that's going to make people resist. And I think people don't often realize that people without solar panels on their roof are paying for the backup distribution wires and capacity for their neighbors who have solar power, because somebody's got to pay for that. And in most places, the solar power customer doesn't pay for that. So especially in these times with all the financial problems globally from the pandemic, it's kind of hard to see people wanting to throw money at wind and solar. And, you know, it is, I don't like the term environmental justice. It's more like, you know, okay, if this neighborhood has toxins, clean them up. I don't care whether they're people of color or not. But people have noticed that most of the people who drive electric vehicles, no name will be mentioned on this podcast, they are above median income and often well above median income. And so, you know, the argument in California that, oh, we should come up with a bigger subsidy for poor people, or you should have means testing, I think that gets into a big can of worms, and it's going to make it a lot more difficult for electric vehicles to catch on. But, you know, obviously you're not going to get solar panels on your apartment ceiling.
It's all about hydro and geothermal. And so I'll preface this with, yes, we have seen these insane predictions from people like MZ Jacobson that claim you can just double the number of generators in every hydro dam. While it's true that we can electrify a lot of the dams that are only used for flood control, there's still a limit. There's a limit to the hydro, and even if, you know, we get advanced geothermal, there's a limit to the amount of geothermal that's out there. What's your take on that, Mike?
There's two kinds of geothermal: wet rocks and dry rocks. Hot dry rocks, which one of my old MIT colleagues used to promote, and couldn't understand why people didn't want to pay 3 times as much for electricity from a clean source. You drill a hole and you pump water in and pump it back out again. The problem is, if the Earth's crust is thick, like in New England, if you got granite, you have to go down 10 miles or something, and it costs a fortune. So, you know, these are things where there's a huge energy resource out there: ocean thermal, wind power, you know, just all kinds of stuff. I mean, you know, you can make gasoline from urine, although I'm not, I guess Budweiser would support a subsidy for beer drinkers. But the point is, a lot of it's just really expensive. And unfortunately, what you find is people saying, we want green energy. And if you say, well, first of all, nothing's completely green. And secondly, how much you're willing to pay for it. And they go, well, I heard it's cheaper. And, you know, there was I think it was Mad TV did a skit where the woman comes in and says, you should sign up for this telephone program. It's cheaper. And they go, cheaper than what? And she goes, you know, cheaper. And it's kind of like that with the renewables. So, you know, we're going to see more deployment of wind and solar. It's going to keep going. It's not going to, I think, accelerate the way activists think is necessary. to reduce carbon emissions. On the other hand, it's quite possible, I think, if we get the 5 or 10 SMRs, small modular reactors up, and people go, wow, this stuff works great. Or, I hate to say it, fusion has been 30 years away forever, except somebody once said the same about electric cars, and now they're here. So there's a lot of stuff going on, including carbon capture, which you just don't know what technology will be available in 20 years. The fast breeder reactor was predicated on the idea that A, we're running out of uranium, or there won't be enough, and B, we don't need the technology yet, but we should start building them now so they're ready when we do need the technology. And it turned out we didn't need the technology.
Chris, I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just wanted to follow up. I've been thinking personally that in about 30, 35 years, once we have small modular reactors, and I do think they're coming, and they operate for a few years, then we're going to start to see these different lifetime cycles for solar, for wind, for nuclear, and people will have to make a decision on, do I want to buy 3 or 4, possibly 5 solar fields and replace them, or have 3 or so wind turbines cycling through every century, or buy 1 small modular reactor and spread that cost out over 60, 80 years. I think it's going to be in the late 2030s, mid 2040s before people start really making that distinction. And I suspect we'll go with nuclear over renewables, but I'm biased. Just curious if you had some thoughts on that.
I think it's all of the above. I have a great picture of my dad in 1944 at the Arc de Triomphe in a GI's uniform. And there's at least 2 books about the invention that won the war. And I said, I think the 10 million soldiers we sent to Europe and the Pacific probably didn't realize they were unnecessary. This is why, carbon taxes, I think, are a lot better. I hate to say it, but it's sort of the liberal, I'll tell you how to live mentality, as opposed to the Republicans tend to tell you, how you should have a moral life, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's the micromanaging that people like to do. And, a classic case, John Holdren, in his 1979 book with the Ehrlichs, Ecoscience, he talked about how, Chinese agricultural productivity probably can't advance much more because their agricultural sector is controlled by the government. So they're probably at peak productivity. And, it's like, why would you think that? It's obviously nonsense, but that was an assumption they were building into all their sort of, we're going to starve to death the day after tomorrow type of arguments. So that's the carbon taxes, I think would encourage the use of a lot of things, some behavioral changes. You can imagine there are a lot of places, remote places, where a solar station makes sense until they can get on the grid. But I think any big urban center, you would want a small modular reactor. And especially, these floating reactors. I hate to say it, the Russians have pioneered the field, but I think other people behind it, where you put on a barge and you go up to port cities around the world and you say, okay, here's, 300 megawatts ready to go.
And just because you mentioned the carbon tax, let me mention for our audience that we have a live show from last week. You can hear all about the land value tax, which is a really great companion to the carbon tax, from our friend Douglas McLean and Ed Dodson. And that was last week on the Ecomodernist channel live. So if you want to see these as they come out, you can follow us on Twitch, subscribe on YouTube, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you get our live broadcast. Notification both on Twitch and YouTube, just in case it gets buried or we get struck for, this misunderstanding of what the generation of those 3 million barrels of oil a year comes from. I can't wait to hear from the Twitch folks that Soyatl has relented, has joined the MAGA communists and their theories of abiotic oil, ignoring sort of the clarifying questions that we went through. It's a great time. So remember, follow us on Twitch at Soyatl and subscribe to us on YouTube at the Ecomodernist channel live. Great. Gabe, please take us away with the next question.
Yeah. I've heard this quite a bit, and it's estimated that we have 400 years of oil in the ground, but that we only have 50 years of oil that is recoverable at a cost that people will pay. In other words, after that, the EROEI, the energy return on energy investment,
Oh,
is
God.
too far off to make it worth it. So,
Yeah,
what do you think?
there's two aspects. One is the amount that's economically recoverable has been growing over the decades. If you go back to about 1950, people said, "Oh, it's 400 billion barrels," and now it's 3.5 trillion barrels because the technology has gotten better, and we know. So, the amount will keep going up over time. I don't know if we'll have nanobots down there, grabbing molecules and bringing them up. That seems a little far-fetched, but, hey, I never thought Elon Musk we'd be selling so many cars. The EREOI, it's one of those things where it's technical, and so people don't question it. The first problem is the estimates vary wildly depending on who you talk to. Secondly, there's a lot of fuzziness in the numbers because they talk about how much oil was discovered, how much effort to discover oil, and sometimes they look at 1979 when the price shot up, and so they say, oh, the amount of money you need to get a barrel out has gone way up, and it's like, okay, that's transient, that will go away. And the estimates, people keep saying, oh, this declines over time. The reality is it goes up and down. The people who promote the idea basically ignore the long periods where it drops sharply, because if you drill in the Arctic Ocean off Norway, it takes a lot more effort than if you drill in Iraq, where you need a little more than a shovel to get 1,000 barrels a day well going. So it depends. If the Middle East shuts down, we're going to be spending a lot more to get the oil out of the ground. But on the other hand, we've seen times like the 90s when the Venezuelan oil industry boomed and crashed the price of oil. That could happen again with the right kind of policies. So the EREOI, I find it sounds great in theory, but when you try to practice it or get a hold of it, it's kind of like intellectual jello. It just kind of squishes through your fingers and leaves you with a big mess.
So those numbers, like if we have an EROEI of 1.4 for ethanol or 7 for biodiesel, those are all impacted by externality. Like the deforestation in Southeast Asia, biodiesel was all the rage, and so we had huge groves of palm oil, and then people kept buying up the palm oil for candies and cooking oils, and now we're switching to avocado oil because it's so great. But where does that avocado oil come from?
Well, I don't know if you remember about 10, 15 years ago, people promoting jatropha, which is a bean that produces an oil that you can make biodiesel, and it grows in dry climates like India. So therefore, you don't have to take good farmland. And when I heard that, I started laughing, because in the 70s, people said the same thing about jojoba beans, which grow in dry land like Mexico, and you get a nice oil out of it. Now, you may have some jojoba oil in your house, but in cosmetics, not running your truck.
I just want to point out two things really quickly. Diesel oil in 1880 or so, old man Diesel was a German inventor. He was wanting to use peanuts to have biofuel for his diesel. So we're still playing with that idea on some level. And also the energy return, energy invested, I think it was invented in the 1960s as a term, and it dealt with calories in marshlands. It was for biology, not for the energy industry, and the energy industry co-opted it.
I know I have a couple of colleagues in Boston who've written a lot on that, and it's biophysical. And I think the first article they wrote, they concluded that between 1995 and 2000, the EREOI would be below 1 in the U.S. oil industry, and so the oil industry would have to shut down by then. And somehow that didn't happen.
Check out our conversations with Mike Stass on this, and how if you believe the same things, you can go off grid and quit your job and just farm and raise cattle in order to survive the coming apocalypse.
It reminds me of the book title, "If You Can't Live Without Me, Why Aren't You Dead Yet?" And that's what whenever I hear the overshoot, it's like, oh my God, we're using up more than of the resources than we can. It's like, so why aren't we dead? Yeah, Ronald Reagan told a great joke from the Soviet days. He said the two Soviet leaders were on a viewing stand watching the May Day parade, and a bunch of Marines go by, and then a bunch of tanks, then some missiles, then a bunch of men in trench coats with briefcases. And Brezhnev says to Kosygin, "Who are those guys?" He says, "Those are the economists from Gosplan." He says, "Well, what are they doing here? They're not in the military." And he said, "No, but you should see the damage they can do."
Oof. All right. Can nuclear energy compete with fossil fuels? This is the big challenge, I think, for the energy advocates, all of the green economists. You sort of pointed to a carbon tax. Do we need a carbon tax, or is there something that we're missing in order to show that nuclear can compete without necessarily going to a carbon tax?
I don't think there's something missing. I think it's a question of you're going to see growth, and how fast it is will depend partly on whether you have a carbon tax or not. A carbon tax makes nuclear look a lot better than coal, especially, and I think would promote that more rapidly. So it's always, sort of trying to shift the demand curve. And if you talk about $10 a ton versus $50 a ton, that can make a difference. But I think the main thing is, once you have some of these new generation technologies like the SMRs up and deployed, the people who say, oh, it'll never work, once it's working for 5 or 10 years, they'll sort of go, oh, okay, it does work. And I think there are people who will oppose anything. Captain Spaulding, Groucho Marx saying, whatever it is, I'm against it. And there's some people like that, but there are some people in the middle who can be swayed by facts. Just as you see now, Michael Golay, the nuclear engineer at MIT, said, the trains were originally scary. The cars were originally scary. The technology gets safer and people get used to them. I have to admit, I never understood why the pebble bed reactor didn't catch on, because that kind of seemed just so simple and obvious a choice. But I do think you'll see maybe some of those in the SMRs. But the biggest problems with the big reactors is a 1,200 megawatt reactor with a 12-year lead time leaves you with a lot of demand and financial risk. And gas turbines were attractive because you could put in a 50 megawatt one, and then another one, and another one. And if you didn't have demand, you just stopped building them, but you had all of them operating, generating cash flow. Whereas if you built half a nuclear power plant, you were screwed. Pardon my French. So the SMRs solve that, where you can buy 50, 100 megawatts and not have to worry that when it's built, all of a sudden you're going to find that it's happened in this country, that the demand is not what people had expected it to be.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest drawback of nuclear.
That lead time. And of course, that lead time can be overcome with sufficient industrial might. We look at China. China is building a gigawatt a month on average until 2030. They just need to extend that to 2050, and 2 or 3 other places around the world need to join them. Maybe because of our economic system in democratic capitalism, we need to allow for smaller units of deployment. And so my follow-up to this is, if we lose a percentage of efficiency, and so things like labor and fuel price and regulatory impacts mean that we go down 20 to 30% in the production per unit labor and per unit fuel, what's the danger in that? Is it really going to kill the SMR? Is the power of finance that enormous that it really doesn't matter?
Depends. You can improve labor productivity, for example. You can bring down material costs with new designs. That's kind of, Elon Musk did that with batteries. It's not that different a battery, but he's made them somehow, and they are cheaper. I'm not sure how much, but they're cheaper than they used to be. I do think you can reach the point where people say, oh, there's 27 SMRs in the South. Why don't we build one in Chicago? What's the problem? And this is the thing, is all the great warnings about nuclear power from the 70s. I was joking about Jackson Browne saying we're going to be overrun by giant mutant sponges. But there were people talking about massive deaths from radiation poisoning and so forth. And James Hansen, the climate scientist, did an article, and he said, gee, it turns out the deaths from nuclear are actually far below that of coal and oil, and I think comparable to solar and wind, although he didn't have much data on solar and wind at that point. That was 10 years ago.
Yeah, we did get the data from US OSHA, and I think Our World in Data, who everyone on the green left loves to hate now because they're against, supposedly the data is against degrowth. So Our World in Data has in fact corrected that, and where previously, because of the efficiency and various factors, the OSHA deaths per terawatt hour put wind and solar worse than nuclear, it's starting to go neck and neck, though nuclear's productivity keeps increasing per person hour, and so it's still a tight race. And some of the source data on that is horribly out of sorts because it's from Michael Schneider, author of the other Chernobyl report.
The greenhouse gas lifetime emissions average for everything, and I'm thinking 800 for coal, about half that for natural gas, and I'm thinking we probably need to get down to, say, by the end of the century, sources need to be like under 20 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour produced. Do you have a thought on that, or is my number too low, too high?
You're outside my area of expertise. That sounds pretty reasonable. But
the UN Economic Council for Europe, for the most recent, most favorable to us meta study that shows, only small hydro really beats nuclear. That's the only one that really does better. Do you see like another great revolution in batteries? Is that in your area of expertise? Are we going to cut the price in half, in quarter? Are we going to discover a magical super dense battery that competes with fossil fuels?
Well, the first thing I would say is it's not clear how much the lower battery costs have been due to innovation, either in design or manufacturing. Some of it is. Some of it may be due to subsidies in China and weaker environmental regulations in the processing of minerals. I know you're shocked. Looking at the data, and the last few years are so crazy, it's hard to trust them too much, but it seems like the cost declines are leveling off. What you find with conventional productivity measures is you often get like a 2 or 3% a year improvement just in, making steel. Solar and wind have come down a lot, but I think we're kind of reaching the limits. Certainly on the efficiency, conversion efficiency on solar, for example, and you're not going to somehow raise the capacity factor on solar. It's a function of the sun, period. So I think we're kind of running out of that now. I do know people tell me the lithium ion battery is just not going to make it in the long run. And there are other things like ultra capacitors, which have promise. The problem is people have been talking about that for years. And it's, when you talk about a breakthrough as opposed to progress, you can say, oh, we want 3% improvement every year for 20 years. The engineers can do that standing on their heads. But if you say we need an entirely new type of battery that's, 3 times the capacity and has 5 times the range and a third the cost, something like that, that's a lot harder. There's a great
I've heard, though, that graphene is supposed to be that, and it's that they're actually implementing it.
There's a great book by Stephen Levine called Powered Up about the Advanced Battery Consortium in the 1990s, and they looked at about 20 batteries, and 5 of them looked great in the laboratory, and it turned out one of them worked great in air conditioning, but when they went out onto the Arizona test drive, it degraded very quickly. And there's a lot of things that look great in the labs, and I have lists of batteries, both different types, like the ultra capacities, different types of storage for hydrogen, things like that, they're all technically feasible usually, or a lot of them are, but they're not economically feasible. We've been using batteries for 125 years on a regular basis, and people have been trying. The utility industry has this problem with peak, cyclical demand during the day and during the seasons, and they'd love to have better storage, and they've been working on it, and they haven't come up with something that works very well yet. So that suggests to me that it's a hard problem.
I don't think it's not unsolvable. I think the solution is very much like with peak oil, like you said, it's an innovation.
Yeah.
But,
and one of the dumber things I ever heard was people thought we're going to run out of high-grade iron ore after World War II, and U.S. Steel bought up a bunch of mines, and they had this, we're going to switch from high-grade to low-grade ore called taconite, and it's going to mean the cost will quadruple. And some college professor said, if you take the taconite, you kind of grind it up a bit and use acid, you separate out the iron, and it's cheaper than the high-grade stuff. So, I don't know. I don't imagine that one of us is going to suddenly say, hey, I just figured out how to make a fantastic new battery. But with all the money going into it, it wouldn't surprise me. It won't be out there in the next 5 years, but 10, 20 years from now, it could start taking over the market. That would not surprise me at all.
So what can you tell us about peak uranium? We've got predictions that we've got just a couple 100 years of uranium left, or is it 4,000 years, or is it 4 billion years? And where is this curve in terms of economic recovery? Is it really as brutal as people have predicted for oil, or is it somewhere else?
I worked 40 years ago. I worked on a book, The International Uranium Market. I was just a number cruncher. And one of the things was Tom Neff, the author, my boss, had a table showing how estimates of the uranium resource had kept going up and up. And the big thing was, after the weapons programs, there was no market. People stopped looking for it. And people thought, oh my God, there's not that much out there. And then once the price went up in the 70s, people started finding the stuff all over the place. And in fact, the price crashed by something like 80% in 5 years. There's a lot of uranium out there. You can get it from seawater. It's more expensive, but when you talk about the cost of running a nuclear power plant, it's not that much more. And it wouldn't really affect the economics of nuclear power. The thing is, there's a lot of other uranium out there that you can find, just conventional stuff that, some of it's a little more expensive, but you're going to go for that before you start separating from seawater, I suspect.
Yeah, I would think that seawater might be a better choice just for ecological reasons.
And national security as well.
Well, if you're Japan, for example, yes. On the other hand, you can store a 5-year supply of uranium and weather any kind of disruption a lot cheaper than you can with oil or coal. I think it's like 100 to 1 is the economics. I ran the numbers years ago. The experts, quote unquote, pile into the subject, and then the media sort of picks up on the number of people saying something like renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels and nuclear without fact checking it. And with peak oil, I had several reporters where I tried to say, here are the facts, and these guys are saying things that are wrong. 2004 Wall Street Journal, I said, okay, when you talk to Colin Campbell, ask him to explain why he says these things when they're, in fact, I can show you they're wrong. And in the Wall Street Journal, it said, Dr. Campbell refuses to debate Mr. Lynch because he says, I'm a scientist and he's a faith healer. This is Colin Campbell, by the way, said that oil production peaked in 1989 and it would lead to the possible extinction of mankind. Then he said 1992, and then he said 1995. Then he said, okay, 2005. And by now, production was supposed to be down by half, and it's about 25% higher. So I blame the media.
Yeah. And we do see this cycle in a number of different technological, areas where disaster is being predicted. Oh, they're shelling Zaporizhia. It's going to explode. It's going to contaminate Europe, and nothing has happened.
Well, you used to have people say no level of radiation is acceptable, and slowly they came to understand that, the universe is radioactive. You're constantly exposed to some radiation. And, I always say, people say, well, nuclear waste lasts a long time. And I say, arsenic doesn't degrade. Arsenic is forever. Mercury is forever. Lead is forever. You don't want to drink any of those. And people live with that stuff all the time, unfortunately, sometimes too much. But as they say, it's the dose that makes the poison. I'd rather have an SMR down the street than a coal plant. That's for sure.
Sometimes I have to admit to people that lead is just old, worn out uranium.
Good point.
Oh,
So I empathize.
Very old.
yeah. Well, this has been an outstanding program. Thank you so much, Michael C. Lynch. And let's see, make sure that I get the title of your book right. It is The Peak Oil Scare and the Coming Oil Flood by Michael C. Lynch. You can check out a lot of the ideas that we've discussed today in that book. Are you working on anything that you want to sort of promote at this time?
I probably wrote the only serious book that quotes both Gilgamesh and Rocky and Bullwinkle. So,
yeah.
I'm writing a book called Petroleum Follies, and it goes through a lot of the different things, like some of the energy policies, but also some of the economic theories that proved out to be kind of silly. For every good idea, there's about 19 bad ones, and people rarely seem to learn from history.
Thank you so much for coming on our program. You can catch us every Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern on the Ecomodernist channel live right here on YouTube. Or Soyaddle, that's Seattle without the C, add in some soy, here on twitch.tv and many other different broadcasting places on the internet. Find us on the Ecomodernist Society of North America on Facebook or esna.earth. To help spread the word, please support nuclear energy. Remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.